On June 4, 1943, in Mexia, Texas, Unoffizier Werner Burkhardt wrote in his hidden diary, his pencil trembling slightly as he recorded words that could have landed him in solitary confinement if discovered by his own officers. He wrote, "The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts." Through the train window, Burkhardt had just witnessed something that contradicted 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights illuminated every farmhouse, street corner, and shop window. The Texas plains were covered by an endless constellation of lights, glowing at 10 p.m. In contrast, in Germany, blackout regulations had darkened the country since 1940. Even before the war, only 20% of rural German farms had electricity. Yet here, in a country Nazi propaganda labeled as decadent and collapsing, electricity flowed freely. 150 veterans from Irwin RML's Africa Corps stepped off the passenger train, not from cattle cars or freight wagons, but from cushioned Pullman, coaches with dining services and sleeping berths. The entire population of Mexia turned out to watch their arrival. What no one knew was that this moment would trigger a profound psychological transformation in modern history. It would be a systematic destruction of Nazi ideology, all through the visible display of American industrial power. The true mathematics of Allied victory were being written not in battle strategies, but in production statistics that would soon dismantle every assumption these soldiers held about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. The collapse had begun on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, surrendered with approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The numbers varied as scattered units continued to surrender over several days. The Wehrmacht's most experienced desert fighters, men who had driven the British back to Egypt, who had earned Montgomery's respect, were now prisoners. Among them was Headman Friedrich Radke, a holder of the Iron Cross First Class and a veteran of the France campaign, wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, later found in the National Archives, provided one of the most detailed accounts of the psychological impact of American captivity on German soldiers. The journey from defeat to revelation started in the port of Oran, Algeria. As Radke and 30,000 other prisoners waited in makeshift camps for transport ships, American efficiency began to break their preconceptions. The U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners daily with an organizational precision that the Wehrmacht had never achieved even at the height of its power. Identity cards were photographed and filed, medical examinations were completed, inoculations were given, and Geneva Convention rights were explained in fluent German by American officers specially trained for this purpose. But the first real shock came with the food. Oberleutnant Hans Mühr, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later, "In the cage at Oran, while we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, that they were trying to impress us. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration." The Liberty ships that carried them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to American industrial might. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. If the Germans had known this, they would have dismissed it as impossible propaganda. These ships, produced at a rate of 3 per day at the peak of production, were returning from delivering supplies to the European theater. Rather than sail back empty, they carried up to 30,000 prisoners of war per month by summer 1943. The 2-week Atlantic crossing in July 1943 provided the second phase of psychological destruction. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a detailed account, which survived in letters to his family after his repatriation. He noted, "The ship's crew disposed of more food waste each day than my entire company had received in 9 weekly rations during the final months in Africa. The Americans threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long. They did this openly, not to mock us, but because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. The ships themselves became floating classrooms on American power. The prisoners learned that the vessel carrying them was one of 2,610 Liberty ships that would be built during the war. Each ship required 250,000 parts assembled from components manufactured in 32 states. The engines, as the American guards casually explained, were built in 3 separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders that were then assembled in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, whose Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs, "As our ship approached the American coast, I watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. This technology, which we believed only we, and perhaps the British, possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel." It was then that he first suspected that Germany had already lost the war. At Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia, the first sight of America shattered the last remnants of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The base spanned 4,300 acres, with docks stretching for miles, and cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships simultaneously. In just one day, this single port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg did in a week. Gerrit Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr region before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading and unloading. In his secret diary he noted, "Each crane lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany. They moved with electric power, smoothly, continuously, without the coal smoke that choked our industrial cities." The prisoners were then marched to waiting trains, passing parking lots full of civilian automobiles, hundreds owned by dock workers. In Germany, private car ownership was reserved for the wealthy and Nazi elite, and the promised Volkswagen had remained a distant dream, with fewer than 1,000 delivered to civilians. Yet here, ordinary workers drove to their jobs in their own cars, but nothing prepared them for the trains. These weren't boxcars or the cramped 40-and-8 wagons. Those used to carry German soldiers across Europe, but full passenger coaches. Pullman cars with padded seats that converted into sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, and observation cars with panoramic windows. Hedman Radke wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." The American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant even apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly. Air conditioning. In August, the prisoners had believed such luxury existed only in Hitler's personal train. The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to camps in Texas and Oklahoma would prove more damaging to Nazi ideology than any military defeat. As the trains rolled through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces against the windows, seeing an America that couldn't exist according to everything they had been told. Every small town was brightly illuminated, and towns like Martinsville, Danville, and Greensboro, which in Germany might have been lucky to have a single electric street lamp, were glowing with electric signs, shop windows, and houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. They passed factories running night shifts, with their windows glowing and parking lots full, even at midnight. Oberwachtmeister Mayer, whose father was a Nazi Party block leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered in 1987, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Everyone had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said we would see." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched as American railway workers did in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, and mechanized lubrication systems. Every part of the operation demonstrated technological superiority. More disturbing still was the casual wealth of the workers. They wore leather boots, which would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empties into bins without a second thought. They smoked continuously, stubbing out half-finished cigarettes. Failed engineer Heinrich Müller, from Siemens before the war, calculated that The single railway yard they stopped at used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. They left lights burning in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. As the trains moved through Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners saw American industrial power in full display. Through the windows, they watched endless factories, each larger than anything they had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched along 3 miles of the river, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilodollars of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, they passed the Rubber Town complex, where synthetic rubber plants had sprung from empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers, produced 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never produced more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, immediately understood the implications. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built, and there were 4 of them, just in this one location. They told us there were dozens more across the country. The trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles away. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1.55 million parts manufactured by WWII subcontractors. The plant consumed 2.5 million square feet of floor space and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Luftwaffe pilot Hutman Verli, who had been shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion. We had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, would fall apart in combat, but I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could imagine possible. The deeper the trains traveled into America, the more complete the destruction of Nazi mythology became. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge, while below them, barges carried more grain than Germany's entire harvest of 1942. The prisoners saw grain elevators stretching along both banks, each holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unreiche Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition, in endless quantities without concern for loss. I watched them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped at a massive stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle awaited slaughter. The smell of meatpacking plants filled the air for miles. German prisoners, who had been lucky to receive 200 grams of meat per week in Africa, watched as American workers ate beef sandwiches during their lunch break. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote griefer Paul Fischer. "No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wished we could eat bread." The guard bought them hamburgers from a stand near the station. Meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for 15 cents. He bought 20 of them without thinking and paid with a $1 bill. This wasn't special. This was their normal food. The arrival at the camps marked the next level of cognitive destruction for the prisoners. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners, offering conditions that exceeded what most had experienced even as civilians. The wooden barracks had electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Each building used more lumber than entire villages in Germany possessed. The camp hospital amazed the medical personnel among the prisoners. Oberst Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals, complete with X-ray machines, surgical equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer later testified. This miracle drug we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs, while the Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchen was another example of American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of preparing meals for 5,000 men. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, things German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, just excess. American regulations require us to prepare 10% more than needed to ensure everyone gets a full ration. The surplus is discarded. I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage." By September 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture led to the employment of prisoners in fields and factories across the country. This decision, driven by necessity, proved more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda campaign could ever achieve. Groups of prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through the American heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything: endless fields of corn and wheat, factories running 3 shifts, shops full of goods, parking lots full of cars, and houses with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unreizier Herbert Lang witnessed a machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could handle in a month using traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. Lang recorded, "The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, just a farmer. He had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including the Negroes, ate lunch from boxes containing more food than German workers received in a week. And this was normal. Every farm we passed was the same." In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields, witnessing agricultural mechanization that seemed beyond comprehension. They learned that a single combine harvester could do the work of 100 men. The fields stretched to the horizon, each one larger than entire German counties. The farmers spoke casually of yields that would have been fantasy in Germany: 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 on the best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, wrote, "The farmer's son, a boy of 16, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father had earned in his lifetime." When Hoffmann mentioned this, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be even better. The most devastating realizations came to those prisoners who worked near or in American factories. While Geneva Convention rules prohibited direct war production work, prisoners could work in industries that freed American workers for military production. This technicality allowed thousands of German prisoners to witness American industrial power firsthand. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners saw production lines processing more tomatoes in a single day than most German factories, handled in a month. The facility operated with a skeleton crew of women and elderly men, as most young workers were in the military, yet production still exceeded peacetime levels. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, documented the experience. Everything was automated: electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers that processed hundreds of maïm cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to the radio and drinking coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant got glimpses of the automotive industry's shift to war production. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed 100,000 workers making jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. Oberwachtmeister Franz. Kellner wrote, "We could see the parking lots, thousands of cars belonging to workers. In Germany, even our officers rarely owned cars. Here, factory workers drove to work." The guard told us that many workers owned 2 cars, one for work, one for family use. We thought he was mocking us. By winter 1943, the cumulative impact of these observations was producing what American intelligence officers would later call ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The secret re-education program run by the Probst Marshal General's Office documented increasing numbers of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Noland, a member of the monitoring team, reported in December 1943, "The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis have become quiet. They still maintain loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory. Many openly question what they were told about America." The camp newspapers, created by the prisoners themselves, began reflecting this transformation. Der Ruf, the paper published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to discussions of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. The editors, carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners, found their audience increasingly receptive. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censors, describing how his views were changing. "We were told that America was a weak, divided mongrel nation, controlled by Jews and incapable of military prowess. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were lied to by criminals. The most devastating blow to Nazi ideology came from an unexpected source: the treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender in September 1943. Italian POWs who agreed to cooperate were placed in Italian service units, given better quarters, higher pay, and more freedom. German prisoners watched their former allies working alongside Americans, eating in American restaurants, and even dating American women. Oberfeldwebel Friedrich Schulz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we treated them as allies. They work freely, earn money, send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own system." Christmas 1943 brought the most profound psychological shock. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers just months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though regulations prevented most from accepting. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from Hearn sent homemade cookies and cakes, and the Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This kindness shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies. Yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power." The Christmas feast itself was incomprehensible. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, and ice cream. Quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before World War I. The prisoners ate until they were sick, unable to comprehend such resources being lavished on enemies. "We ate like kings," wrote Feldwebel Hansa. "Better than German generals, better than party leaders." And this was not special. The guards told us this was a normal American Christmas dinner. If they can feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat? By early 1944, over 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses, and Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge was insatiable. Prisoners who had been told Americans were cultural barbarians discovered libraries with millions of books, universities that welcomed all social classes, and scientific research that led the world. They read American newspapers freely, comparing multiple viewpoints, something impossible in Nazi Germany. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared knowledge with enemies. This generosity of spirit was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology." The camp theaters showed American films, not propaganda, but regular Hollywood productions. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, seeing a depiction of American defeat and recovery that resonated with their own situation. They also watched The Grapes of Wrath, amazed that Americans would show such self-criticism to their enemies. "They hide nothing," wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. "They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker." In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here it is considered patriotic. Spring 1944 brought expanded prisoner labor programs as American production reached its peak. German POWs worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing the full might of American industrial power. The numbers told a story that no propaganda could counter. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that would become landing craft for D-Day. They watched as workers assembled 700 boats per month, each requiring 20,000 parts. The factory employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women operating cranes, welding hulls, and managing production lines. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote, "Women doing men's work, Negroes operating complex machinery, teenagers running drilling equipment, everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. Yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They produced more boats in a month than our entire Navy built in a year." At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the production of 10,000 tons of steel daily. The blast furnaces ran continuously, fed by endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale defied German comprehension. "This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr at its peak," wrote Oberwachtmeister Paul Hartmann. "I thought I understood industrial production, but this was beyond imagination. They wasted more steel in spillage than we could produce. The workers complained about overtime while producing quantities we couldn't achieve with slave labor and double shifts." The summer 1944 harvest provided the final blow to Nazi propaganda about American weakness. German prisoners worked across the Midwest, witnessing agricultural production that could feed the world. In Kansas, they watched wheat harvests where single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combines moved across fields, like ships across an ocean of gold, each one harvesting 100 acres per day. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. Unreizia Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote, "One American farmer with machinery does the work of 100 German farmers. They showed me aerial photographs of the wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined." In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon. They watched as perfectly good fruit was discarded for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been treasured in Germany. Entire crops were sometimes plowed under to maintain prices, a concept that caused psychological breakdowns among prisoners from hunger-ravaged Germany. "They destroyed food to keep prices stable," wrote Gefreiter Otto Schultz. "Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because they had too many. We begged to be allowed to send them to Germany to our families. The guards were sympathetic, but explained it was impossible. The waste was strategic proof of unlimited resources. On June 6, 1944, when news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse.
The scale of the operation, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave, demonstrated American organizational capacity beyond anything Nazi Germany had ever imagined. Prisoners at Camp Shelby watched newsreels of the invasion within days.
They saw the endless streams of ships, the artificial harbors, and the supply system that delivered 15,000 tons daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they had been told was too weak to fight. Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources." Throughout their captivity, German prisoners experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology more than any material wealth: American humanity. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as weak and sentimental, POWs discovered a people secure enough in their strength to show mercy. When Gerrit Hans Miller's son died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany, enemy civilians in a nation America was actively bombing. They separated the German people from the Nazi regime, wrote Hedman Otto. They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans. This distinction, which had once seemed like propaganda, turned out to be genuine. The Americans prepared us to rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it. The medical treatment, in particular, had a profound impact on the prisoners. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning new techniques and using advanced equipment. Prisoners received surgeries that would have been reserved for the elite in Germany. Mental health care, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, was provided to traumatized soldiers. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote, "They treated attempted suicides with counseling, not punishment. Prisoners with mental breakdowns received therapy, not beatings." This humanity toward enemies revealed a strength we never understood, true confidence in their power. By March 1945, the secret re-education program had produced remarkable results. Over 25,000 prisoners volunteered for democracy courses. The camp newspapers began publishing articles about constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's future after the war. The program exceeded all expectations. Prisoners who had arrived as fanatical Nazis were now writing essays about democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn loyalty to Hitler were discussing how to implement American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. "We became missionaries for democracy," admitted Oust Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reich Marshal, in a 1975 interview. "Not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation. We saw it work. We saw ordinary people living better than the German aristocracy. We wanted that for Germany." The transformation was so complete that American authorities began worrying. The prisoners were too enthusiastic about American ways. Some requested to stay in America after the war, and others even married American women they met through prison correspondence programs. Thousands would eventually immigrate to America in the 1950s. April 1945 brought the final revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the footage was shown to German POWs. Many refused to believe it at first, claiming it was propaganda, but the evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and eventually letters from Germany confirmed the horror. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had held some pride in German honor despite military defeat now had to face the complete moral collapse of their nation. Everything they had fought for was not just defeated, but evil. Oberfeldwebel Walter Schmidt wrote the most eloquent summary. We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually meant. As the war ended in May 1945, German POWs faced repatriation with mixed emotions. They had witnessed an America that contradicted everything they had believed. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers. They had been treated with more dignity by their enemies than by their own government. The last months of captivity were spent preparing for return to a destroyed Germany. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction. Prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before it was even announced, understanding that America would rebuild, not punish, Germany. They prepared us to rebuild our country, wrote Ust Friedrich von Tobin. They gave us skills, knowledge, and hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens. This generosity from the victors was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi vindictiveness. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German POWs were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a divided, destroyed, and destitute Germany, but they brought with them something precious: knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. The German POWs who experienced American prosperity became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They had witnessed industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and democratic prosperity. They knew Reconstruction was possible because they had seen it in America. Many former POWs rose to prominence in West Germany's Reconstruction. Hans Kroll, a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Co., became president of the European Commission. Rudiger von Marr, held at Camp Herne, served as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackermann, a prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in German agricultural reform. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was partly built on knowledge gained in American prison camps. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs. We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, and that treating workers well increased production. These lessons learned as prisoners shaped the new Germany. Historians have called the German POW experience in America one of the most successful re-education programs in history. Without coercion or traditional propaganda, American industrial might and democracy converted hardened Nazis into future democratic citizens. The program succeeded because it relied not on words but on observation. Prisoners saw American society functioning at peak efficiency while treating enemies with dignity. They witnessed industrial capacity that made German production seem primitive. They experienced a standard of living that exposed Nazi promises as fantasies. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the leading historian of German POWs in America, concluded, "America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but through sheer reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The POWs were converted by prosperity." The statistics support this assessment. Of the 371,683 German POWs held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape, with only 2,222 total attempts recorded. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German POWs held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing their families to show them where their transformation had begun. Former Oberwachtmeister Hans Wehe, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later became a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke at the reunion. Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who had grown up in cold water. Flats in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food, but more than that, we discovered dignity. Former Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Meir, who had worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes their homes. This humanity from people whose sons were fighting against us changed us forever." At the 1985 reunion dinner, former Oberleutnant Hermann Gutz, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address that captured the essence of the transformation. "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom." We witnessed the arsenal of democracy at full production. We saw farmers who produced food for the world, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity. We learned that America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence. We returned to Germany with a mission to build a society focused on creation, not destruction. A society that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons we learned in American prison camps. We arrived as conquerors, but left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends. Thank you for showing us the way. The magnitude of the German POW experience in America is reflected in stark statistics that show both the scale and remarkable success of the operation. Over 500 camps across 45 states, all except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont, housed prisoners. There were 175 main camps and 325 branch camps, with each camp built in an average of 90 days, housing anywhere from 250 to 12,000 prisoners. The total German POW population reached 371,683, part of the 425,871 total Axis POWs. The peak population occurred in May 1945. Monthly arrivals increased after D-Day, 20,000 in 1943, 30,000 after D-Day, and 60,000 in the final months of the war. POWs contributed 14 million man-days of agricultural labor, processed 100 million board feet of lumber, and provided 230 million in labor value, 1940s figures, earning 80 cents a day. Prisoners filled critical labor shortages in 46 states. Escape attempts were minimal, with only 2,222 attempts, 0.6%, out of 371,000 prisoners, and no successful permanent escapes. Most escapees were recaptured within 24 hours, and no American civilians were harmed by escapes. In terms of education, over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in educational courses. There were 135 camp newspapers, with 30,000 prisoners taking English classes, 15,000 in vocational training, and 8,000 receiving university correspondence courses. After the war, approximately 5,000 former POWs immigrated to the U.S., and 12,000 maintained correspondence with American families. The average duration of correspondence was 31 years. Many returned as tourists or business partners. In terms of treatment, 95% of prisoners rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% believed captivity positively changed their worldview, and 61% expressed interest in learning about democracy. By 1945, fewer than 10% still held strong Nazi beliefs. The German POWs who experienced American industrial might didn't just witness history, they were transformed by it. Their captivity became their education. Their defeat became enlightenment. Their imprisonment became liberation from the ideological chains of Nazism. In the end, America's greatest victory was not on the battlefield, but in the prison camps, where overwhelming evidence of democratic prosperity achieved what armies could not, the complete transformation of enemy minds. The POWs arrived believing in German superiority and American weakness. they left knowing the truth. American industrial might was not only overwhelming, but incomprehensible to minds shaped by scarcity and tyranny. The trains that had brought them into captivity in 1943 carried warriors of the Third Reich. The ships that returned them to Germany in 1946 carried architects of democracy. They had seen the future, and it worked. Their story stands as a testament to a profound truth. America's most powerful weapon was not military might, but the overwhelming evidence of what a free society could achieve. The German POWs were stunned by American industrial might, but ultimately they were converted by it. In their transformation lay the seeds of Europe's post-war redemption and the final defeat of the Nazi dream. They returned to Germany not as defeated enemies, but as witnesses to what free societies could achieve. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s was partly built on the knowledge gained in American prison camps, where enemy soldiers learned that prosperity comes not from conquest, but from freedom, not from racial superiority, but from human dignity, not from totalitarian control, but from democratic cooperation. The German POWs had arrived in America expecting to find a weak, divided nation on the verge of collapse. Instead, they discovered an industrial colossus of unlimited power and surprising humanity. They came as prisoners of war, but left as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its peak. In their awe of American abundance lay the psychological seeds of the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the democratic reconstruction of Germany. They had seen America, and they would never be the same. Their children would grow up in a democratic Germany allied with the United States, a partnership built on the transformation that began when 1,850 Africa Corps veterans stepped off a train in Mexia, Texas, and discovered that everything they believed was wrong. The story of the German POWs in America is ultimately a story of redemption through revelation. It proves that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through demonstration, not through propaganda, but through prosperity, not through hatred, but through humanity. The German soldiers who witnessed American industrial might became unwitting ambassadors of democracy, carrying back to their homeland the seeds of transformation that would bloom into one of history's most successful reconstructions. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens remains one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history, accomplished not through force, but through the overwhelming evidence of what free people can achieve when they work together. In the end, that was America's secret weapon. Not just the ability to produce more tanks and planes than any nation in history, but the capacity to transform enemies into friends through the simple power of example. The German POWs were stunned by American industrial might, but more importantly, they were changed by it. And in that change lay the foundation for a better world.